There's a lot of suffering about at the moment, isn't there? Um, did you know there was a book written some 4,000 years ago that speaks about a man who suffered? Um, it's probably the oldest book you could ever read in English. It's the book of Job in the Bible. And it speaks of a man called Job. He was a good man. But, often when suffering comes, people talk about the fact that why does suffering happen to good people? Or maybe it seems that evil people get away with things, but and good people seem to suffer. The stories about Job. I've done a little example here of Job being down here and God being up here, because Job was a God-fearing man, and he always tried to do the best thing, But Job was also a very rich man, and Job was a farmer, and he had quite a lot of cattle and sheep and all sorts of things. In fact, the Bible tells us that he had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. I think that's probably about 1,000, and 500 donkeys. And also, Job had a big family. He had 10 children. And one day, Job's children were in a house all together having a party, and someone came running up to Job and told him something quite terrible. What they said was this. They said, Job, we were out there on the hills with your donkeys and your camels, and a group of Sabaeans came and attacked us, and they stole all of your sheep, and in fact, even worse, they killed all of your servants, and I'm the only one left here to tell you the story. And while he was just finishing up speaking, someone else came running towards Job and said, Job, the sheep that were on the hills, those 7,000 sheep, well, a great big fire came from heaven and struck those sheep, and it not only killed the sheep, it also killed all the servants except for me, and I've come down here to tell you that has happened. And while he was still speaking, someone else came running down and said, Job, your 3,000 camels. Well, another group of people, the Chaldeans, came rushing down from the hills in 3 raiding parties, and they stole all your camels and killed all your servants except for me, and I'm the only one here left to tell you the story. And while he was just finishing off speaking, someone else came running towards Job, and I reckon Job at that point said, oh no, not the kids. He said, Job, I've got something terrible to tell you. There was a great big wind that came from the desert, and it blew against the house, and the house collapsed, and it killed all your children. And it not only killed all your children, it also killed all your servants in the house as well. And I'm the only one left here to tell you the story. And the Bible tells us that Job fell down in worship before God. And he said, naked I came into the world, and naked I shall go out. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It's quite amazing that Job didn't curse God at that point, but he didn't, and his life continued. But the story also continues that Job, it didn't end there, because it wasn't long before Job was struck down himself with some terrible illnesses. In fact, he was struck down with boils and sores all over his body, and it was so bad, that it says he sat in a heap of ashes, and he actually scraped his skin with some pottery because his sores were so bad. In fact, he was afflicted from sores from the top of his head right down to the soles of his feet. And Job was not only lost everything, he'd also now lost his health. Job was in a pretty bad way. And even Job's wife said to him, Job, why are you holding on to your integrity? Why don't you curse God and die? In other words, why don't you forget God? God obviously doesn't care about you, Job. But have you noticed that during that time, something was happening to Job? I'm sure you can see. On top of that, some other people came and spoke to Job. They were supposed to be his friends. And his three friends came and they gave him all sorts of ideas why this might have been happening. Job, perhaps you've been a real bad man. Perhaps secretly you haven't been such a good man as you appear. And they began to ask questions, but they didn't really have any answers at all. A lot of the stuff they said was right, but actually they had no real understanding of God or who he was. They tried to give Job crass answers about what had happened. But you know, nobody really had any answers. In the end, even Job himself began to ask questions of God. And he said, God, why has all this happened? In fact, Job even got to the position where he said he cursed the very day that he was born. Why on earth was I born to this? Job had really suffered. You know, suffering really does make us ask serious questions, doesn't it? And you know, I don't know about you, but we're certainly facing some suffering today. Maybe you've suffered already, and I know I've suffered in the past, and when that happens, you know, suffering really hurts, but suffering can either drive you from God or can do what's happening to Job and draw him even closer to God. You know, at the end of the story, it tells us that God didn't give Job any crass answers. In fact, he didn't really give him any answers at all, except to say to Job, Job, what do you really understand? Were you there when I formed the world? Were you there when I created things and made them come into being? And Job realised that actually there was very little he knew about God, or even about himself or about the world. But he did realise that God really did know and God really did care for him. The interesting thing is this, God doesn't give any answers to Job, but he just says, Job, what do you really know about this? What do you know really about life? But at the end, it's interesting that God restored to Job all the things that he had before. In fact, the Bible tells us that he blessed him even greater than what he had before. And the things he restored to him was his family and even more goods. But you know, suffering really does make us ask some questions. But it's really interesting that it's interesting also that later on God himself suffered in the Lord Jesus Christ when he came and died on a cross to bring us closer to God. Perhaps that's what the story is about, that God was telling us that even he suffers, and God in his suffering draws us closer to himself. I hope you found that useful. You know, it's a very short synopsis of the story of Job. Perhaps one day you can read it for yourself. Thanks very much for listening.